following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and welcome to another episode of The Package Tourist, hosted by the Package Tourist in the magical mystery tour called Life, Matthew DiBiase. Tonight, he will be discussing his predictions about what will happen in America the day after the 2020 presidential election.
Thank you, Ralph. Tonight, I am going to discuss some hypothetical scenarios America might face the day after the 2020 presidential election, which will take place exactly 366 days from now. When convicted Donald Trump conspirator Michael Cohen testified before Congress, he told the assembled congressmen and congresswomen that there would be no peaceful transition of power if Donald Trump was not reelected president. Unfortunately, Cohen's prescient remarks were lost in the avalanche of Republican vituperation and other distractions brought on by the never-ending scandal that is the Trump quote-unquote administration, though a more accurate term should probably be the Trump conspiracy, since like Nazi Germany, its every action reeks of criminality and its conduct resembles that of a criminal conspiracy. I, for one, believe what Michael Cohen said in his testimony. I believe that the day after the 2020 presidential election, there will be a widespread outbreak of violence, a 21st century version of Kristallnacht, a right-wing fascist pogrom directed at those sectors of American society that have resisted the Donald. Those non-white groups that have for nearly 3 years have lived in the crosshairs of the Donald's race hatred and targeted by the militias and hate groups that worship and work towards the Fuhrer and the Donald state. Those organizations who sought to protect the Constitution, uphold the law, and preserve our civil rights and civil liberties against the evils perpetrated by the Donald and his henchmen. Jewish synagogues, African American churches, Muslim mosques, quote-unquote liberal newspapers or TV stations, Planned Parenthoods, the headquarters of women's advocacy groups, LGBTQ bars are all potential targets for any future outbreak of fascist terrorism, and they would be advised to prepare themselves for all forms of potential violence if Trump loses the 2020 election. This post-election day violence will either serve at a minimum as retaliation for the Donald's defeat, or else serve as a prelude for a fascist coup d'etat to overturn the results of the election and impose fascist rule over America. For any coup attempt to succeed, the Donald will need his militias, his hate groups, and his right-wing vigilantes as foot soldiers, or more accurately, stormtroopers, to overthrow democracy, kill and destroy his personal and political enemies, and enforce the fascist tyranny that will soon follow. Even if a coup d'etat does not take place, there will still be violence because the right wing, when faced with the possibility of a Democratic president and both houses of Congress controlled by the Democrats, will have no choice but to resort to violence to disrupt and halt the necessary liberal reforms which need to be made in order to make sure that the Donald's attempts at installing fascism in America never ever takes place again. When right-wing forces have their backs to the wall, they inevitably respond with extreme violence. I expect no different from the Donald's henchmen who lurk in the shadows, awaiting orders to strike against America. And even if there is no fascist pogrom or coup attempt, there are other ways conservatives can derail the democratic process and undermine a new Democratic administration, especially if the new Democratic president represents the new progressive side of the party, like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, or even Pete Buttigieg for that matter. The Constitution mandates that both houses of Congress count the electoral votes in order to certify the presidential election. What would happen if GOP conservatives in both houses refuse to show up, thus ensuring that there is no quorum sufficient to count the electoral votes? Then that would mean that the election is not certified, thus posing a constitutional crisis. That might give the Donald time to try to overturn the results one way or another, either through violence or some type of legal chicanery. Another ominous possibility is that those states who will vote for Trump in 2020 decide not to recognize the results of a Democratic presidential victory. That they decide, like their ancestors did in 1860, to threaten a secessionist movement and declare Trump the president of their racist, sexist, homophobic, fascist confederacy. That is not inconceivable. When the Affordable Care Act was passed, there was talk in certain southern states, Texas especially when Rick Perry was governor there, of seceding as a way of denying access to Obamacare for its citizens. Nothing came of it at the time, but the fact that such talk was being bandied about cannot be discounted or dismissed. If the Democratic candidate wins in 2020, and that candidate is either Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, or Pete Buttigieg, and the Democrats also regain control of the Senate while retaining the House, then there is a certain expectation of a massive restructuring of America in order to counteract the fascist, racist, sexist, and oligarchic policies of the Donald. It would be a restructuring that would condemn the conservatives and their Neanderthalic policies to the dustbin of history, where it properly belongs, I must add. Just like 1860, when during the aftermath of Abraham Lincoln's election as president, the southern states one by one seceded from the Union rather than live under a Republican administration that would seek to stop the expansion of slavery once and for all. I suspect the Republicans who control power in those states loyal to the Donald will also band together in defiance of a new Democratic administration who, working with a Democratic Congress, would strive mightily to end racial discrimination, restore voting power to non-white citizens, do everything it can to destroy the glass ceiling which has inhibited the rise of female America from achieving its full economic, intellectual, political, social, and sexual equality, renewing the First Amendment protections of the free exercise of religion and the freedom of speech and protest, and leveling the economic playing field where our policies no longer rob the needy to enrich the greedy, but gives everyone a fair chance to succeed. And the act of defiance could be a refusal to recognize the results of a Democratic victory. Instead, these states would proclaim that Trump is still president and start seizing federal facilities and defying any federal court orders and jailing anyone sent to enforce federal laws enacted by a Democratic administration. And if you think I'm kidding, then recall this. When Obamacare was improved, then Texas Governor Rick Perry threatened to use Texas State Police to arrest anyone sent by Washington to enforce the Affordable Care Act. He didn't carry through with his threat, but the fact that he had the temerity to make that threat cannot be disregarded. How many other Republican governors, given the desperation of their position, might resort to fascist tactics to resist any revival of American liberalism in America? If the Donald's followers do not resort to secession, then there is another form of resistance they will likely follow in the months and years following a potential Democratic victory in 2020. And we have already seen the faint glimmers of this potential course of resistance. In the very first Republican presidential debate, which took place in 2015, former Arkansas governor and 2008 GOP presidential candidate Mike Huckabee made an interesting statement when he was asked about how he would deal with Supreme Court decisions like Roe v. Wade and the Supreme Court's decision to recognize gay marriage. Huckabee stated that if he were elected president, he would use the White House as a bully pulpit to encourage a conservative civil disobedience campaign throughout the country where conservatives would publicly protest to make sure that abortion clinics could not function and county courthouses could not issue marriage license to gay couples. As Huckabee put it, he wanted to use this conservative civil disobedience campaign as a means to coerce the Supreme Court into overturning its own precedents that granted these rights to women and to the LGBTQ community and to any other oppressed groups in America. Earlier this year, we have seen the first fruits of this conservative disobedience campaign when GOP state legislatures in Missouri and certain other states passed extremely draconian acts that virtually denied all women in these states any type of access to abortion or any other kinds of feminine health care provided by Planned Parenthoods operating within those states, such as cancer screenings, family planning, and other preventative health checks as well. These acts were a deliberate flouting of Roe v. Wade and the Casey versus Planned Parenthood decision by the Supreme Court during the early 1990s. These acts represented new lows in the decades-long GOP war against the American woman, but they must also be seen as harbingers of future conservative resistance to any future Democratic administration backed by a Democratic Congress. I can envision conservative states passing blatantly discriminatory acts against women, against minorities, especially with regards to minority voting rights, against the gay community, against non-Christian sects, in blatant defiance of any new type of federal laws which seek to restore or reinvigorate those rights. It would be like Southern resistance to Federal Reconstruction Acts following the end of the Civil War, and sometimes that resistance took on very violent forms. I expect the same will happen here if the Democrats sweep the board next year. Finally, there is another form of resistance conservatives can resort to if the Donald is defeated in 2020. The federal courts, and most important of all, the U.S. Supreme Court. Thanks to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who has conveniently and routinely bypassed the Senate filibuster rule to approve hordes of conservative judges, some of whom lack even the basic judicial qualities needed to be worthy of consideration, to make the federal judiciary safe for fascism for decades to come. The U.S. Supreme Court has a solid majority of 5 hardcore conservatives plus a horde of conservative judges dedicated to ruling based on their ideological prejudices and with brutal disregard for precedent. If conservatives are stymied legislatively or politically, then one can see a sad repeat of what the U.S. Supreme Court did from 1933 to 1937, during the early years of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first term in office, legislating from the bench by making rulings that overturned those New Deal acts of legislation that did not conform to the 19th century laissez-faire conservatism of the Supreme Court at that time. The Supreme Court's overt campaign against the New Deal became so pronounced that FDR resorted to his infamous court packing scheme, where he tried to convince Congress to increase the size of the Supreme Court, which would allow FDR to pack it with justices sympathetic to the New Deal. FDR's attempt backfired, and it adversely harmed him politically throughout his second term in office. Given the ideological rigor of the Donald's judicial nominees and their desire to work towards the Fuhrer, like Brett Kavanaugh, one could see the U.S. Supreme Court eagerly overturning any newly passed congressional acts that try to level the playing field. This happened before during the Obama administration, when the Supreme Court issued the Citizens United decision, which allowed conservative PACs to drown and distort the electoral process with money to promote conservative causes while denying others their right to express themselves. The Supreme Court also drastically weakened the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which gave conservative states carte blanche to pass laws that sought to weaken non-white voting rights or deny non-white citizens easy access to register to vote, and even adversely affecting the voting rights of women as well. It also encouraged the blatant gerrymandering that has allowed conservatives to preserve control of state legislatures in defiance of state demographics, thus allowing state legislatures the power to obfuscate and obstruct any Democratic governor from making decisive changes. This is a very likely scenario when contemplating the aftermath of a potential Democratic victory in 2020. In fact, there is a brutal irony to this type of resistance. For decades, conservatives derided liberal courts legislating from the bench to expand the rights of citizens. But in order to maintain the Donald's fascist politics, they will have to resort to the same tactic, conservative judicial legislation as a means of destroying any new birth of American liberalism. In the end, the real victims will be the American people, and it will be one more step towards the decline and fall of America. If we are to triumph next year and vote the Donald and his henchmen and henchwomen out of office, it will not mark the end of the struggle, but the beginning of an even tougher and even crueler campaign. Given the desperation of the Donald and his Confederates, one must expect a desperate, violent, and brutal retaliatory response to any electoral defeat. I suspect the days, weeks, months, and years following Election Day 2020 will be a stern, sad, disheartening, oppressive, radical, fearful, and perhaps even apocalyptic ending. But if this country is to regain a new birth of freedom like Lincoln invoked in his Gettysburg Address, then we must rededicate ourselves to that noble cause which Lincoln gave his life for in 1865. We must make the efforts and sacrifices to restore democracy to this country, to secure the rights for all citizens, to make America America again, not only to save this country, but also to restore hope to the world, which has lost hope because under the Donald, our country has routinely betrayed the hopes and ideals of our founding fathers and the principles of the American Revolution. If we harness our fervor to removing the Donald from office in 2020, then we must not allow that fervor to dissipate once we regain office. That fervor must be maintained so that we can save the future by securing the present, that future generations will actually have a future where they can live and thrive as free American citizens. We cannot sit on our hands. We cannot wring our hands in frustration. We must act now and we must prevail, because if we fail, then a new dark age will enshroud America and the world. Remember, as the 18th century British parliamentarian Edmund Burke once said, "For evil to flourish, it is required that the good do nothing." Next week, I will be discussing the legacy of the late Charles Manson 50 years after he committed the Tate LaBianca murders, and how his evil legacy still infects and corrupts America today. Thank you, and good night.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.